Hello, beautiful souls. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Carolyn, and this channel is all about true crime, mystery, and anything abnormal. I highly recommend subscribing because this channel is definitely a vibe. Today's story is about the Servant Girl Annihilator, who was a serial killer in 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas. And one thing that's really interesting about this serial killer is if you were to Google who was America's first serial killer, Google's going to tell you it was HH Holmes. And if you're into true crime, you probably know who HH Holmes is. If you don't, he was the killer who had the murder hotel in Chicago during the World Fair. But this serial killer committed his crimes 6 years prior to HH Holmes. This story takes place in Austin, Texas, and begins in 1884. At the time, Austin, Texas was becoming a very busy city. Business and population was growing like crazy in Austin at this time. 2 decades earlier, Austin, Texas had a population of only about 5,000, and it was just considered a cattle town. But by 1884, it was a bustling, busy city. Until these murders began, Austin had a very low crime rate. There were not a lot of criminals in the city and not a lot of crimes being committed. But the Servant Girl Annihilator would completely change that and terrorize the city. Molly Smith was a 25-year-old Black young woman who, along with her husband, Walter Spencer, worked for a local wealthy family, and they would cook and clean for the family. They also lived in the family home. That night, Walter woke up screaming in agony. He jumped out of bed to go and look in the mirror, and when he did, he saw a huge gash down the side of his face. He composed himself a little bit and looked around the room and realized that somebody had trashed the living area that Molly and Walter lived in. He also noticed that Molly wasn't there, and he could see a blood trail leading outside. Walter followed the blood trail outside, and when he got outside, he found Molly's body deceased, and she was covered in stab wounds and cuts to her body. Police were called and came to the home, and while the police were searching Molly and Walter's room, they found an axe with dried blood on it, which they determined to be the murder weapon. And I'll just let you know, in this story, I won't be adding pictures because there aren't any. When you go back and research cases from the 1800s, there's very rarely pictures of people. And in this case, because most of the people that were killed were servants at the time, they probably hadn't ever even had their picture taken. But yeah, I tried to find pictures, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to. But after Molly was found dead, police searched and could not really come up with anything. And there was no other crimes committed for 6 months. On May 6th, 1884, Eliza Shelley, who was another Black cook who worked for a state legislator, her body was found dead by her employer. She had 3 children who all lived with her. The murder was almost exactly the same as Molly's murder. The only difference was the brutality of the attack had escalated. And this part is really gruesome, but she had been hit so hard in the head with an axe that her head had split in 2. When her body was discovered, she was on the floor, but her bed sheets were bloody and underneath her. So it appeared like the killer had come in, attacked her while she was asleep or while she was still on the bed, and then he dragged her body onto the floor. And that's one thing with this killer is he always seems to move the bodies, and it seems like he wants to bring the bodies outside because most of the bodies are discovered outside and they aren't killed outside. He, for some reason, is moving the bodies outside after they had died, or, well, in the process of them dying, in, I'm sure, some cases. In this case, there was actually a witness, because in the first case, even though the husband had been attacked, he had been asleep when he was attacked, and he never saw the attacker. In Shelley's case, her 8-year-old son had seen a man come into their cabin. He couldn't give a description, and I mean, witnessing your mother being murdered at 8 years old, I'm sure, I can't even imagine how an 8-year-old would handle that. But he wasn't able to give a description to them, but he was a witness, and the killer didn't seem to mind leaving witnesses, which is something else that's very interesting about this killer. 2 weeks later, the killer killed another woman. Her name was Irene Cross, and she was killed in a very similar manner to the first two. And she was also a young Black servant. So this is how the killer gets the name, the Servant Girl Annihilator, because he's literally annihilating servant girls. In Irene's case, police were called, and when the police arrived, Irene was actually still alive. She did speak with the police, but I couldn't find any information as to what she told the police. She probably didn't tell them much, because if she had told them something identifying about the murderer, I'm sure that it would have been, written about. But it's just said that she was still alive when the police arrived, but died very quickly after. And what Irene lived through is absolutely horrific. She did end up losing her life that night, but when the police arrived, her arm was almost completely severed from her body, and she had been scalped. And this woman was still alive and conscious when police arrived. So it's just horrific to even imagine being awake and being aware of that happening. Because the first couple of killings, it seems almost as though they could have been killed while they were asleep. And I always when I hear about people being killed, and I'm just hoping, I hope that they were asleep and they just didn't even experience it. But unfortunately, Irene experienced a lot before she eventually did lose her life that night. In August, the Servant Girl Annihilator struck again. This time, he went and attacked a servant named Rebecca Ramey. But this time, he didn't focus on her. He focused on her 11-year-old daughter. He attacked Rebecca, the mother, so that she was incapacitated, and then he dragged her 11-year-old daughter, Mary, outside, where he R-worded her and then stabbed her to death. And when Mary, the 11-year-old girl, was found, there was actually a metal rod that had been stabbed into her ear and went all the way inside. And unfortunately, Mary initially survived the attack, but ended up dying later that night. The next victims would be the first time the killer killed 2 people at the same time, but it would not be his last. The next 2 victims were Gracie Vance and her husband, Orange Washington. They were servants who lived and worked in the home of a local attorney. In the early hours of September 26th, Gracie awoke to the horrifying sight of a man standing above her. And that just has to be the most terrifying thing I can imagine. Waking up in your bed and there is some stranger with an axe standing above you. It's just so terrifying. As soon as Gracie saw the man, she screamed, and her husband, Orange, woke up and tried to jump to defend her, but unfortunately, the murderer hit Orange in the head with the axe to incapacitate him so that he could murder Gracie. Before killing Gracie, he actually attacked 2 other young women who lived in the same quarters as Gracie and her husband. He R-worded the 2 of them, and he hit them both in the head with an axe, but they both survived. Finally, he turned his attention back to Gracie. He dragged her outside and bludgeoned her to death with a brick. And in this case as well, he left the axe that he had used to kill Gracie's husband Orange and attack the other 2 young women. He just left the axe there. Lucina Body, who was one of the servants who was attacked but not killed, reported seeing some strange things. She had seen the attacker, and the attacker had yelled at her not to look at him. And when the police discovered Gracie's body outside, she was clutching a gold watch, and the gold watch did not belong to her, her husband, or anyone else that lived in that household. So it's believed that the killer brought the gold watch with him. And no one could ever figure out what the meaning or reason behind that was. But this was with Gracie. He was actually able to get her outside and commit her murder outside. And it seems like all of the killings, he was either killing them, dragging them outside and killing them, or killing them and then dragging them outside. So Gracie had passed away that night, and then Orange Washington, her husband, he survived the initial attack, was taken to hospital, but unfortunately he lost his life the next day. On Christmas Eve, 1885, the Servant Girl Annihilator would commit 2 murders in 2 entirely different locations. And these 2 victims, unlike all of his previous victims, were white. The first woman he killed was Susan Hancock, and when she was described by a reporter, she was described as the most refined woman in Austin, Texas. The other person he killed that night was 17-year-old Eula Phillips, and they were both murdered in their homes. Susan was killed just before midnight on Christmas Eve, and she had been killed so brutally. Her head as well had been split in 2, and he had also done something he had done earlier to a victim, where he would shove something sharp and metal through their ear to literally into their brain. Eula's life had been taken about an hour after Susan, and her body was discovered the next day. Eula's head had been crushed, and she was found on the ground. And one thing that was different about Eula's murders and the rest of them was she had large pieces of lumber on her arms, almost as though it was pinning her down. And this part really terrified police, because all of the other murders, they were very easily able to connect all of them. But the last 2 murders, they were always a little unsure. Was it the same killer, or was it a copycat? And her having the lumber on her, there was a lot of construction going on during this time in Austin, Texas. They were building new houses, new buildings, like there was a lot of construction going on. So some of the police thought it may have been out of convenience that he was easily able to get this lumber to hold her body down. But what he had done with the axe and in the ear was exactly what he had done to the other women. So in my opinion, it seems to me as though it was the same person. But there's quite a few conspiracies about who this person was, because these murders were never solved. So at the time of these killings, serial killer was not even a term that was used, but police would obviously link the cases knowing that it was the same killer. They just didn't use the term serial killer. At the time, police, there was no thought given to analyze crime scenes and try to come up with a profile of a killer. It just simply wasn't something that ever occurred to the police to do at that time. There was no DNA, there was no fingerprints, there was no blood types. So all police really had to go with was they would use bloodhounds to try to track suspects. And the police had bloodhounds out in the streets of Austin every single night, and they were never able to come up with anything. Police also brought in private investigators to see if possibly private investigators could figure something else out that the police could not find out. But again, no, nothing was discovered or figured out. And then the murders stopped. Altogether, the Annihilator had murdered 8 people, 6 young women, 1 man, and an 11-year-old girl. There were over 400 men arrested in Austin as being suspected of being the Servant Girl Annihilator, which I think maybe they just thought everyone did it. I don't know. They had 400 people they arrested as a suspect, but nothing ever came of it, any of it. A few of the victims' husbands and boyfriends were suspected, and they tried to bring charges against them, but there was no proof at all that they had been involved in any of it. One of the suspects was a man by the name of James Maybrick, and he is also a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, but everything that I researched, it kept saying he was a suspect, but I couldn't find any information as to why they believed that he could possibly have been the Servant Girl Annihilator, other than the fact that he was in Austin, Texas at the time of the killings. There really wasn't any other information as to why he should be suspected. And I don't think back then they really had much to go on. Another suspect, and the suspect that is the main suspect in the case, was a Malaysian cook named Maurice. He worked at the Pearl Hotel in Austin, Texas, and all of the murders took place very close to the hotel that he worked at. Maurice had also told acquaintances that he was getting on a ship and going to London, England, and he left Austin, Texas a few weeks after the murder stopped, and he showed up in London to be there just in time to possibly be Jack the Ripper. My personal belief on Jack the Ripper was the doctor who's part of the royal family. That's who I personally believe was Jack the Ripper. But in this case, the crimes were very similar in the sense that they were extremely brutal, extremely violent. It seems as though the Servant Girl Annihilator really wanted to either kill his victims outside or bring them outside after they had been killed. And obviously we know with Jack the Ripper, he was killing working girls on the streets of London. So there was kind of this connection of the brutality as well as committing the crimes outside. But other than that, to me, I don't really know if I would really consider it a serious belief that the Servant Girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were the same person. But there's definitely people who do believe that they are the same person. So that's the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator. So the next time you hear someone say that HH Holmes was America's first serial killer, you can be like, I know someone who killed before. I personally don't believe that the Servant Girl Annihilator was the first serial killer. I believe there were other serial killers, and I might actually go and try to research and find what is the oldest case that I can find, because HH Holmes was not the first one, but Google wants to be telling you otherwise. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Please subscribe if you have not, and thank you so much for being with me here. I really, really appreciate everyone. You guys are so supportive and so sweet, and I will see you in the next one.